going to be looking at air masses, so go up and grab your notes and make sure you have them on your desk ready to follow along. So when you think of an air mass, what exactly is an air mass? Well, it is simply a large body of air with similar characteristics throughout. So what that means is the air mass might be warm, and the whole air mass is warm. It might be moist. The whole air mass would be moist. So it's that body of air or an area of air that has like qualities. It's either hot or cold or wet or dry. So we classify air masses based on their temperature. Are they hot or cold, cool or warm? And the amount of moisture. So are they really wet, high moisture, or are they dry, low moisture? They actually get those characteristics, their heat or their moisture, from where they are formed. So if you think about it, if an air mass forms over a desert, it's probably going to be hot and dry. If it forms over an ocean, it might be hot and wet, it might be cold and wet. Kind of depends on where they form, and that's where they get their characteristics from. So there's two things we're going to look at when we're deciding how we're going to classify our air mass. The first is we're going to look to see if it's continental. Was it formed over land or dry land, or is it maritime? Was it formed over a large body of water? That's what maritime means. So first we decide dry or wet, continental or maritime. Then we decide, okay, where did it come from? Did it come from the tropical area, so it's warm? Did it come from our polar area where it's cold? Or did it come all the way from the Arctic where it's very, very cold? So we're going to put those together so we could have warm and dry, we could have warm and moist, we could have cold and dry, we could have cold and moist. So when we put all those together, it gives us the exact characteristics of any specific air mass. So when we look at a couple, let's look at an MP. Well, we know that M means maritime. Maritime means it's going to be wet. P means polar, so it's going to be cold. So this is going to be a wet, cold air mass. An MT, on the other hand, is still going to be wet or moist because we have that M for maritime or M for moist, but we have a T. This T is for the tropics or the tropical, which means it's going to be warm instead of cold. So they're both M's, so they're both moist, but one is cold and one is warm because where it was formed. Let's try a couple more. So we have an M. Well, what do you know about that? Right, it's going to be moist or maritime. And A means it's going to be Arctic. So you can think Arctic or Antarctica. So that's really cold. So it's going to be moist and very cold. How about a CT? Well, C means it formed over a continent. So it's going to be dry. It doesn't have a lot of wet or moisture that it can pull in because it's formed over a continental area. And T we know is tropical or in the tropics, so it's going to be warm. So a CT would be a dry, warm air mass. All right, so see if you can guess these on your own. CP. So talk through it. What does the C mean? Well, I could have wet or dry. Wet would be moist, which would be maritime. So C must be continental, and it means dry. P means it's from the polar area, so it's going to be cold. So here, we're going to have dry and cold. Our next one will still be dry because we've still got that C, continent, but it's going to be very cold because we have the A for Arctic. So here's a great visual. You can see up top, we know on the top of our globe is the Arctic, or the poles, the North Poles. So coming straight down, we see a CA. It's coming over the continent of the top of North America, but it's coming from the Arctic, so it's very cold and dry. As it moves down into the polar area, it's still cold because it's in the polar, and it's still over the continent, so it's going to be dry. But flanking it on the right and left, we've still got cold air, but instead of being over the land, it's coming in over the Atlantic and the Pacific, which makes it moist. So we have our moist cool. And then finally, coming from the equator down below, we've got some maritime or moist tropical. And then we've got some continental tropical. Okay, it depends on where it's formed. So we've got some that were formed right over the water and some that were formed over the land, such as Texas and Mexico right there where we have the continental dry. Take a moment, really study this picture. Talk it out. If it's not already colored, take some time to color it in your notes. Here's another view. You can see some maritime tropical down there near the equator. You can see some maritime polar as you go up further. And then you've got some continental tropical, continental polar, little continental Arctic way up there. So just a different view, same concept. So let's look. What kind of air mass would be over in this area where 1 is? Well, the first thing I have to say is it's in the ocean. So I know it's going to be maritime. And it's way down here near the equator. So I know it's going to be warm. So maritime tropical. Let's see if we're right. We are maritime tropical. Okay, let's look at 2. Well, it looks like we're still in the water right here, right? But we've moved up some. So maritime, because we're still in the water, but we're up higher, so it's probably going to be cold. I'm going to say it's probably a polar. What do you think? You're right, maritime polar. Let's look at number 3. Well, are we still here over the water, or did we move over the land here? Because it looks like we're on a continent now. So we know it's a continent, so it's going to be dry. And that's going to be probably Arctic. Let's see if we're right. It might be polar. Let's see if we're up high enough. It is continental Arctic. All right, let's go way down to 4. What do we know about it first? Well, it's right here on the land, so we know it's a continental. And let's see, it's not polar, it's not Arctic, so it must be tropical. So it's our continental tropical, which means it's going to be dry and warm. All right, let's head up to 5. 5, look, we're still on our continent. We didn't go back in the water yet. So we know it's going to be continent. And we're not quite down here at tropical anymore. We're definitely not high enough to be Arctic. So it's probably going to be a continental polar. Let's check and see if we're right. We were right. All right, let's look at number 6. Wow, look, 6. We're right down in the water again. Our land is over here, and then we start our water. This is all water, which means we know it's going to be an M for maritime. We're down near the tropics again, so maritime tropical, which means moist and warm. All right, you do the next 2. 7, think about where you are. Land or water. Are you near the tropics, the polar, or the Arctic? All right, were you correct? And then finally, what do you think about 8? Ask yourself, land or water, tropic, polar, Arctic. So we're up a little high. I might give you that was a maritime Arctic also, because it looks like it's about the same latitude as 3. So I would give you maritime polar or maritime Arctic if you chose that. So as you look at this, you're going to see one that you go, well, wait a second, we didn't talk about that. There's one right in the middle that's a special one. It's maritime, because it is over the ocean, but it's equator. So it's really hot because we're on the equator. So it's a maritime equator. Then we have these continental, we have these polar, we've got Arctic. So remember, it's where it's formed. Is it formed over land or water? And the latitude. Where is its latitude? Is it close to the equator in the tropics? Is it in the polar region where the westerlies are? Or is it way up where the polar easterlies are in the Arctic? Here's just a wonderful view of some of the air masses coming through. We know them as kind of clouds, but clouds also contain air, like an air mass. Here's a good illustration of one coming over the water, so we know it's going to be maritime.